I used to be very interested in everything that was complicated. The more esoteric it was, the more fascinating I thought it was, the more secretive and esoteric. So there must be something deeper, so it was this assumption that the more complicated or difficult it was to access, somehow the deeper it must go, or the more powerful it must be. And so you probably all heard me share the story of how when I received Kriya Yoga initiation and the teacher said to smile as we did the practice. And at the time I thought, that's just a distraction. I'm focusing here on this very important secret practice. And then it took me years to suddenly realize the effect of just relaxing into the smile and just letting that posture, you could even call it, that posture of the smile, that attitude of the smile, just really start to take effect, for the body to rest in that state, which is an expression of well-being and openness and trust. And by creating it, you also stimulate it. So normally we would think the smile is a result of feeling good. But what we can, the one way that Tantra works is kind of going a step ahead and creating an effect, you could say, from the future. So, there's the expression in English, fake it till you make it. And it kind of relates to that, that you can align yourself with the state that you're seeking. And when I say you're seeking, I don't mean necessarily it's a mental intention, a plan, but there's something that as an organism we're seeking to grow into, to experience a sense of wholeness and fulfillment. And we can use practices that in a way mimic that state of fullness, fulfillment. And in a way, they don't just fake it, they actually align us with it. They start to create physiological effects. So it's not just you're pretending, you're actually stimulating that state, you're bringing it into being. So that was a huge wake up, in a sense, that realization that when I was doing that practice with all the esoteric elements, but if I just sat there and smiled, most of what I had experienced, if not all of what I experienced through the complex practices, it just seemed to happen by itself, by really just settling into that openness that the smile brings. And I perhaps this realization came partly because it came from various sources. It came from my Kriya Yoga teacher, but I was also studying Taoist practices. And in the Taoist practices, there was also the work with the inner smile. And so it was really reinforced, the importance of this generating an inner state, an inner attitude, working with energy in healing practices, again, reinforced it. So there was a few things that kind of came together, and that, if I was to explain how does this approach that I'm sharing with you to breathwork and meditation and to Tantra, where does it come from? Is it simply like, my teacher taught it to me like this and I teach it to you like this? It really comes from a synergy of experiences with different teachers and teachings, which feels like they unlock the key of the teachings. There are things that I received, but I wouldn't have fully understood without that synergy. The practice would have been mechanical to some extent, instead of an enlivened, awakened, empowered practice. And so that's a core characteristic of what I share with you. There are elements of technique, but it's also a falling away of technique and resting in the natural state, you could say, our beingness. So there is a kind of a goal, a technique, a map of a kind of sorts, but also an invitation to rest in beingness. And there's a balance that's established, and a being on the edge of these that we work with in this approach. There was another story I wanted to share, which is that when I learned rebirthing after years, or experienced rebirthing before I trained in it, but when I experienced rebirthing after years of learning healing techniques, spiritual techniques for personal development, I was absolutely amazed by the simplicity and the power of conscious, connected breathing, which is essentially what rebirthing is. The idea that you can learn courses that take years, and you can learn all sorts of complicated things about anatomy and the different elements, and there's many ways in which we can enrich our knowledge and complicate things. And yet, by being aware of your breath, and by not pausing between breaths, and we'll explore what that means, what the effect of that is, why that is effective. But my experience of just doing that, being aware of the breath, keeping it connected, it was absolutely extraordinary. It was, some of the most powerful healing and spiritual experiences that I had were just coming from breathing consciously and without pause. So that got me again reaffirming the value of simplicity. And I think I've shared with you all perhaps that I learned rebirthing with Leonard Orr, who is the founder of rebirthing. And what I observed with other teachers, and even in the programs that Leonard Orr was teaching, because there would be co-facilitators in these programs. So he would only be teaching a part of the program, and the rest would be with another facilitator. And I participated in 3 programs with him. Three programs with him. And in fact, I think I participated in the last training he gave, possibly, because just after he came to Portugal to give the 10-day training and the Breath Master program, he took what was going to be a year's retreat, basically. And soon after that, he passed on. So one of his co-facilitators just told me the other day that if I understood correctly, that was actually the last training that he gave. So what I saw even in the rebirthing, even with Leonard Orr as in the program, there was a complexification that had taken place when compared with what he had written, what he had described as the methodology. And I even heard, because in one of the programs, there was a few experienced breath workers there, people who'd worked with Leonard before. And I heard one of them kind of confessing that sometimes they would intensify the breath, not because it's really necessary for the method, but because it would create an intensity in the experience of the person. And that would make them realize the effectiveness. So it would almost be, you could see it as a kind of an artificial intensification, just to get not just to get positive feedback, that would be perhaps an unfair way to put it, but for the person to appreciate what they're going through. Because it can be so gentle, so simple, so natural that you could, the effect at the end of a practice could be someone just says, yeah, I feel good. I feel like, you might find that like nothing, in a way, nothing much happened. There's just silence at the end of it. And that silence is actually very precious, but it's not dramatic. They wouldn't necessarily point to some huge catharsis, some huge insight, but just to an absolute silence, quality of presence. And sometimes as a therapist, as a guide, we might not realize that we fall into the trap, let's say, of trying to make it more dramatic. I've noticed that in some of the sessions I gave, especially when I started to shift towards a much gentler approach, really tuning in to what was the original format of the rebirthing. I even at the time thought I was discovering something new. And then I realized, also talking with Leonard and going back to his books on rebirthing, that I was actually just rediscovering what he had discovered. And it wasn't presented that way anymore, even in his trainings, like I said. So there is a tendency to get more involved sometimes than we need to as a guide. And this is something that is also a key part of this approach that I'm sharing with you. It's we are involved in the process, guiding a process. We're giving guidelines, let's say, and a kind of a road to follow, but also in the most minimal way, so that people can find and see their road for themselves. That's really an essential aspect of this, that it's empowering rather than substituting the other person's clarity and the other person's intuition and the other person's connection with their you could say with their full consciousness. So we don't want to provide too much in the sense that we are substituting that clarity that they can access. So this is partly what it means to me to come to simplicity, that we are giving room for a natural flowering to take place, giving room for intuition to be able to express itself.